Hello, everyone. Welcome to this latest in a series of FCC Zoom events. I'm Keith Richburg. I'm the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club, Hong Kong. And this discussion is about election in the Philippines and the race to succeed Rodrigo Duterte. And we're going to have a discussion with our guest today, who's going to navigate us through all of this. It's Richard Hadarian. Hope I'm pronouncing that well, Richard. Richard is an Asia-based academic, policy advisor, journalist, sometimes, and vlogger. I've been reading his pieces. He's currently an associate professor in geopolitics at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. He's a lecturer at San Beda University. He's delivered lectures at universities around the world. He's a columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, an analyst at GMA Network. He's written for some of the leading publications in the world, including the Washington Post, New York Times, Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, et cetera, et cetera. His list of places he works for and writes for and analyzes for is way too long. So I'm not going to read it all, or we'd be here for the next 10 minutes reading everything. But I will say thank you, Richard, for joining us, and thank you for helping us navigate the kind of complex but vitally important election in the Philippines. So thanks for being with us.
Pleasure, Keith. Thank you very much for that kind and very pithy introduction. People can just Google me. I always say that. Don't worry about it.
You can Google Richard Hadarian, Heydarian, if you want to find out more about him. If you're not following him, you're doing it wrong. Okay. But now, before we get into the meat of it, I'm really interested in the Philippines. It was my first foreign assignment as a correspondent for the Washington Post many years ago. But for those who don't follow it as closely as you and I do, please let's set this up for a minute. There's an election coming up in May. How many candidates are running? Is there going to be a runoff if nobody gets 50%? How's it work?
Right. I mean, first of all, the Philippines is in Asia. Just for folks who are not aware of that, I think a lot of people mistaken us with either Hawaiians or folks from Guam. Others would be a little bit adventurous and think we're somewhere around Mexico, if not Peru or Latin American. I always joke that perhaps I feel more at home in Mexico than in Malaysia. I mean, we definitely have this Hispanic background. My middle name is actually Foronda, which is the Basque name. So a lot of us have Hispanic backgrounds or that kind of cultural baggage, right? So that makes us very unique in Asia. I think we're the only one, aside from East Timor, which are Christian majority, Catholic majority country also in this part of the world. So it's quite lonely for us Filipinos sometimes to introduce ourselves to the rest of Asia. But we are, last time I checked, still a democracy, not a very functioning one, a very besieged democracy. But in fairness to President Duterte, who has been described as a dictator, I understand our good friends Maria Ressa has written a book, how to, fight a dictator or something like that. Well, guess what? He's not Vladimir Putin. He's not going to stay more than a single term. So since the Philippines reintroduced democracy after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, we'll talk about the Marcoses soon more, what they did, our framers of our 1987 constitution, what they did was to make sure we don't have another Marcos. And one of the things that they did was to introduce very strict term limits. So only a single 6-year term. That's it. No more. No less, depending on the circumstances. No impeachment has happened, but you can get cooped out. Now, these elections, of course, is about determining who will come after President Duterte. But this is not only about the presidential elections. Vice presidents in the Philippines are separately elected from the presidents. But this is also about local, regional, and national elections. Senate, Congress, governors, mayors. So it's a humongous democratic undertaking. And I think as we enter the final weeks, it seems the pandemic cloud is a little bit fading away, and the season of the season of democracy and election is taking over.
And are Filipinos excited about the elections? Do they normally turn out to vote? What's turnout normally like?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about 85-90%. That's the normal rate. So sorry to our friends in France. I don't know how many turned up for the second round for Macron, but we have very high participation. This is very much part of our social fabric. Even dictators like Marcos in the past, he had to have some sort of an elections. Otherwise, I think people would go crazy. And not to mention, there's an economy of this. During elections, there's a lot of redistribution of wealth. Some
Yes.
quite legal, some quite not so legal, right? So
Yeah.
there's also the political economy of elections that we have to keep in mind.
And one more point on this. I mean, the in the past, every president, everyone always thinks they want to stick around after that one term.
Right.
With Ramos, everybody thought they were going to have a constitutional convention. They call it CONCOM or whatever it is. And did Duterte want to stay, or was he ready to go?
Yeah, actually, we have a more cheeky term for that. We call it cha-cha.
Charter change.
Yes, charter change. Yeah. I think right off the bat, as soon as Corazon Aquino was done with their term, which was really a transitional presidency, we were getting out of the mess of the Marcos dictatorship. There were like 7, 8 coups d'etats. Lee Kuan Yew came and kind of poo-pooed the Philippines and said, you have too much democracy, forgetting the fact that we were just recovering from 2 decades of dictatorship. Hello. So Ramos, he comes to power, pretty smart, shrewd guy. And, you know, one of the things he realized 4 or 5 years into his 6-year term is like, I'm not sure this is enough. I think we're just getting started here. But Corazon Aquino and many other people said, this is the last thing we want. We're just getting over from the Marcos hangover. I don't think we want to try something new here. So since then, every president, once they felt maybe 6 years is not enough, they were given a kind of the way out. And President Duterte, it's not for the lack of trying. I think it's for the lack of discipline, for the lack of shrewdness. I mean, as authoritarian as he is by instinct, he's not a very smart guy, let's say. I mean, he's not Vladimir Putin. He's not even Erdogan or Modi. So, you know, he was not able to really cajole the Senate and the Congress to pass a new constitution, to give him a chance to go beyond 6 years. But in fairness to President Duterte, I think he's tired. I mean, this guy is the most absently warlord, absentee landlord, not warlord. Warlord maybe somewhere there.
Or maybe warlord, but okay.
Yeah, that was a Freudian slip, but I'm gonna take it back. Absentee landlord. Sometimes we don't know where he is. Is he in the presidential palace? Is he awake? Is he asleep? Is he around? Is he in China? Where is he? So I think he kind of realized maybe more than 6 years will be too much for him. But I think where he went really wrong, and I think that's where his weaknesses were exposed, was that he wanted to engineer a succession whereby his daughter could become the next president. But because of internal feuds within his family, because of his own protege, Senator Bongo, wanting to run, they mess it up and they give the momentum to someone else, and that's no less than our good friends, the Marcoses.
Well, let me ask you about this. I'm having a bit of a senior moment here because I went to the Philippines as a young reporter in 1986. Filipinos had just risen up in what was known as the EDSA revolution in 86, and they had thrown out the Marcoses. They were corrupt, they were abusive. A lot of people died under human watch, under the human rights regime under the Marcoses when he imposed martial law. And I hear now that somebody named Ferdinand Marcos Jr. may be coming back. So do I just have a long memory, or do Filipinos have a short memory?
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of other Marcoses who wanted to run, except they were dismissed as nuisance candidates. This is the legit son. This is the sole son of the former dictator. So we're talking about Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Yes, you know, I have some complicated relationship with this argument on memory. Again, I mean, our good friend Maria Ressa loves to quote Milan Kundera. I love to quote Milan Kundera. You know it's the struggle between memory. I get it, but honestly, it's not like people don't remember what happened back in the day. For those who can remember, and I don't think people are totally ignorant about what happened in the past. It's more like people have been turned cynical with what came after, right? I mean, the idea is that, okay, we know it was kind of horrible 40, 50 years ago, but come on, it's not like we replace it with the paradise, right? And if you talk about corruption, then they'll say, oh, what about the corruption since the return of democracy? If you talk about, for instance, human rights violations, what about the extrajudicial killings? Not only under Duterte, which is horrible, way worse than even Marcos era by some measures, but even before that, there were a lot of extrajudicial killings against progressive groups, against rebels, among others, suspected activists, among others, throughout the past decade. So I think the problem here is not memory, whether long or short. The problem here is cynicism. The problem here is desperation. The problem here is the sense that people they just want something radically different, because They feel whatever you want to call it, democracy, oligarchy, it has not delivered the promises that it made when the EDSA People Power Revolution took place more than 3 decades ago.
You know, that's interesting you say that, because I hear that in other places. Indonesia, for example, they got rid of 30 years of the Suharto dictatorship, and you hear people now saying that, well, it was better then. Or you even hear that in Russia, for example. You know, we had the communism fell, then you had the Yeltsin years, and with Putin, people are saying they remember democracy not as a great thing, but they remember it as chaotic. Their money lost value, et cetera. So is that kind of what's going on now? They're saying basically that things were a little bit better back then.
Right. Fantastic, Keith. Thank you for saying that. Maybe it's because it's 7 p.m. Or 8 p.m. for that matter. Usually I'm even sharper than this. Actually, what I wanted to mention is this. It's not memory, it's nostalgia. And we know cognitive science, philosophy, they all tell you that nostalgia is not about accuracy of memory. It's about your affective connection to the past based on your frustration with the present. So that was a key word. Authoritarian nostalgia. This is what's taking over the Philippines. This idea that a lot of people are so frustrated with the status quo for so many reasons, and we see this democracy fatigue all around the world, that suddenly they're developing romanticized memories or recollection of the past. You know, I'll give you an evidence. This is very interesting because a lot of people, because if the issue is memory, then how come the people who voted most for Ferdinand Marcos Jr. when he ran for vice presidency in 2016 were not people of my generation, the millennials. It was actually people of 50 years and above. So if you look at the numbers, the strongest base for Ferdinand Marcos Jr., this is, by the way, exit polls, right? We have the final numbers. Actually, it's the older generation. And these are the people, we call them Titos of Manila, meaning the uncles of Manila, the aunts of Manila. Say, you know, during our time, we were young, there was discipline, there was curfew, there was Nutribond, everything was good. You guys do not follow it, you're undisciplined. We have to go back to you see, we have a lot of those kinds of uncles of Manila type of people, right? We call them Titos of Manila. You see, nostalgia is very strong among the older generation. So if you look at it, the millennials actually didn't fall for it as much, because how can they have nostalgia for something that they never experienced directly, right? But disinformation, of course, is also a big problem in the Philippines. I think people in the Senate, in the government have been sleeping on their job. More than 10 years ago on YouTube, there was a kind of a channel called Yellow Monkey. So yellow actually refers to the yellow ribbon, which is a sign of liberal Democrats, the Aquinos and all. So there was this concerted effort, you know, by which side, you know, to denigrate liberal Democrats, portray them as the ultimate villain. And this has been allowed to proliferate for the past decade or more on YouTube, now on TikTok, among others. So I'm not surprised that now the younger generation, meaning Generation Z, who are totally not invested in any of the narratives, come in and all they see is this cool narratives on YouTube and Gen Z, on TikTok, about how everything was like. I mean, this is the argument of Marcos Jr. Had my father not been overthrown, we would have been something like Singapore. And guess what? A lot of middle-class Filipinos go to Singapore and they say how fantastic Singapore is supposed to be. And they say, well, they don't have democracy. They have a fantastic economy. Maybe that's what we need in the Philippines. So this is the problem we're having right now. Disinformation and nostalgia, not a question of memory per se.
And also here in Hong Kong, there's, you know, as you know, there's a large Philippine diaspora here, many of them working as domestic helpers, others working in businesses, et cetera. And it just from my very, very, very informal polling of talking to people, it seems that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is quite popular in the diaspora. What do you think that is?
Yeah, because the diaspora relies a lot on, guess what? Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, right? And if you look at it, that's exactly where their message is created. No, I mean, these are not people who have direct experience of everyday failings of the Duterte administration. These are people who are there abroad. They miss home. They have emotional longing for home. They want to have a strong leader at home because they're facing oppression, depression abroad. So there's all of this kind of a false affinity with people like Duterte's and Marcoses. And no, you know, surprise that they're much more partial to them. But, you know, I also want to push back against another misconception. There's another misconception that first of all, a lot of millennial blaming, which has no basis, is actually the older generation. The second misconception is this: we should have had a series on the myths about Philippine politics. The second one is this: this is about the uneducated masses, this supposedly illiterate people. Well, guess what? Look at the numbers. Duterte actually got the highest proportional support among ABC, who are the richest, most well-off Filipinos. He got the highest level of support in the National Capital Region, which is the most industrialized, high per capita income part of the country. Now, you think that's a freak accident? Guess what? This year, Sara Duterte and Bongbong Marcos have even higher support among middle class and in the National Capital Region. So this is also about the disaffected middle class. The middle class that was against Marcos more than 30 years ago. The middle class that was against Joseph Estrada 20 years ago, ETSA 2 revolution, People Power Revolution, they feel that they didn't get their side of the bargain. Some elites won out of these coups and out of the civilian back coups, whatever you want to call them, people power, but they didn't benefit enough, right? That's why a lot of middle class Filipinos, engineers, mechanics, have to go to Europe, have to go to America. So maybe the Hong Kong demographic is a little bit different, and they feel the system is not delivering. That is why actually a strong base of support for Marcoses and Duterte's, let's just call it the axis, is actually the middle class. English-speaking, literate Filipinos who go to other countries, who are well-traveled. And so it's not a question of education per se. It's a question of orientation and frustration.
Interesting. So again, if you talk to non-Filipinos here in Hong Kong or the US or elsewhere about Duterte, they'll talk about the drug war, they'll talk about extrajudicial killings, they'll talk about all the vicious human rights violations, they'll talk about cracking down on the media. That's not of concern to this educated group of Filipinos?
I had some very interesting conversation. Of course, some of my family members are in California, right? We have Republican friends, right? We have Democrats, of course, but we have Trump supporters and all.
You got a wide group of friends.
Yeah, some of our friends, they're actually in the US, not family members, but some of our friends. I had friends who were Hillary Clinton in 2016, but Duterte in the Philippines. And I said, that's a weird kind of arrangements. I mean, I kind of get the Trump Duterte, right? Or I kind of get also the opposite, but this is how it works. I call it developmental authoritarianism. The idea is that America is already at a high level of development. Maybe someone like Hillary Clinton can handle it because institutions are strong. You just need a smart, meritocratic person at the top. Philippines, lower level of development, you need more political will. You need more kind of political voluntarism. That's why you need a strong man because institutions are weak. In short, I'm sure they haven't read about it, but in short, we need a Peter the Great, right? Because we're kind of like backward Russia. We need to catch up with the rest of Europe. You need a strong man to lay down the foundation. So subliminally, this is the message. So the Hillary Clinton Duterte supporters were the most fascinating to me in 2016. But that taught me a lot about how a lot of middle-class Filipinos are thinking. They're saying that we're so rudderless. Our institutions are so broken. Political will is the only way to get it through. But of course, when you ask them what is political will, you get all sorts of mumbo-jumbo answers. But that's besides the point, right? Because voting is an emotional thing first and foremost. Let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah, indeed. Let's get right into the meat of it now. What are the latest opinion polls show, and what do you predict? Put on your prognosticator's cap for me for a second.
I mean, how can I put it? I mean, as early as October, in a piece for Monocle magazine, I called it. I said Bongbong Marcos will be the front runner, and that was when people thought Sara Duterte will still run as a kind of a replacement candidate. I said no, the sheep has left. The Marcoses were waiting for that little opening, and as soon as Duterte gave them, boom, they grabbed it. I mean, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is already in his mid-60s. He cannot wait another 6 years, right? And if another Duterte won power, it will be a different dynasty. It will be a different regime. They'll be out of the picture. So as soon as the Marcoses got that little opening, they seized the opportunity and essentially coaxed and cajoled the presidential daughter, Sara Duterte, to run as a vice presidential candidate instead. So they were able to outmaneuver Duterte very smartly. So since then, I said, no question, the Marcoses will be in the pole position. Now, what we could not predict perhaps was the gap. And if we are to believe some of the surveys, the gap is so huge. But let me contextualize that. You know, when people talk about surveys, maybe this is a little bit more extreme case, but surveys show Putin's popularity is like 80, 90%. But who in their right mind will take those surveys seriously? In a climate of fear, disinformation, how much do surveys really mean? So some people would argue that maybe Philippines is not Russia level, but it's not necessarily your Switzerland, right? If you look at the extrajudicial killings, shutting down of ABS-CBN, what they have done to Maria Ressa, all of the death threats people like me have been getting right and left. I'm not sure you want to take all the surveys necessarily on the face value, right? But yes, if you were to bet on who's going to win, assuming this election is really as competitive as it should be, right? That's another question, right? Then yes, of course, Marcos and Sara are in a very, very good position to win this race and win it big. And according to some surveys, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. could become the first Filipino president in recent memory to win the majority of votes. Because I didn't mention this a while ago, Keith.
Yes,
we have no runoff elections.
The runoff, like in France, they had a runoff.
Exactly. So our geniuses who framed our constitution, I have a lot of things to say about them. One of the genius thoughts that came about is that it's too expensive. Let's just have one round. Whoever just wins more, let it be. Now, in 1992, it was a crazy situation. Our President Ramos won by only 24% of the votes, barely 24%, and had Imelda Marcos and Danding Coangco, so the first lady under Marcos and the first oligarch of Marcos. Had they not run against each other, Marcos could have been back in power as early as 1992. So, I'm just saying, so this is quite a ridiculous situation, because if you look at elections in Chile, in Peru, a lot of these countries would have had a totally different regime right now. You would have Fujimori in Peru now. You would have a supporter of Pinochet in Chile now. But that's not what happened. There was a runoff election. There was a chance for the opposition to rally support. And now you have radically progressive governments in Latin American countries, which are very similar to the Philippines. Similar history, similar weaknesses, similar levels of economic inequality and political inequality.
So it's the first, the front runner, no matter how small their margin, can win with 25, 28, 30, 32% of the vote.
Yes, I mean, as I said, as little as 24% could do it. Even plurality could do it, right? Now, things didn't go to necessarily hell under Ramos, but that was a reflection of his strength as a candidate. That is not a reflection of strength of the system. So I think this is the problem. You don't put the price on the cost of runoff elections. And the thing is this, runoff elections also encourage coalition building, encourage tactical voting, encourage people to be more responsible about their voting. It creates a totally different culture of voting. So when you didn't introduce runoff elections, are we surprised that the opposition could not unite? So the story of this election is this: the House of Duterte and House of Marcos, sorry, it sounds like Game of Thrones because it is, have joined their houses for these elections, while the opposition is a 50 shades of division, right? So are we totally surprised that the opposition is doing nowhere as close as they should be?
You got in a House of Cards analogy and also a 50 Shades of Grey. I like that. That's but so who's going to come in second or behind the Marcos Duterte ticket if you had to guess?
Well, I mean, LENI Robredo, current vice president, who narrowly defeated Ferdinand Marcos in 2016, is obviously the alternative based on the numbers we're seeing, and she's inspiring a kind of unprecedented level of voluntarism, especially among the middle classes in the Philippines. The middle class in the Philippines is actually not small. If you count the C, which is the lower middle class or aspirational middle class, we're talking about 25 million Filipinos, as big as the population of Malaysia or Australia at least, right? So it's pretty big. And that's why I'm not surprised to see hundreds of thousands showing up in LENI Robredo's campaign, including a grand rally she had over the weekend where, according to their numbers, 400,000 showed up. They want to have 1 million strong meeting the Avance, which is the last big event before the election day. So the middle class, a lot of them, that plurality that is with LENI is mobilizing very strong. The question is, can it capture the imagination of the disaffected, majority? That's, or let's call them, or what we call soft voters. Because let's just put this into context. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was only 13% before he registered for the presidential elections. I'm talking about the second quarter. Sara Duterte was 30%. So the moment that he convinced Sara to step down, essentially not run for the presidency and run for vice, he absorbed that 30%, and then it had a multiplier effect. So he jumped it up to 50%. So naturally, that tells you that more than half of his voters are what we call soft voters. So the challenge for LENI and other candidates was to attract these soft voters towards themselves. And so far, I think the results have been mixed, because the opposition itself is so divided that I think it has made a lot of the soft voters think twice about switching their votes away from Ferdinand Marcos.
How reliable are the polls? Do you expect any surprises, or do you think in general, based on past results, that they've been kind of accurate?
Well, I mean, I personally know the heads of at least the two authoritative survey agencies, Pulse Asia and SWS. There are other survey agencies, some of them new, some of them not so known, some of them led by political lobbyists. So that tells you everything, right? And then there's some of these mumbo jumbo mobile online surveys. And it's like, obviously, you're not going to get the poorest people on your mobile surveys because they have to have reliable internet, like common sense, right? But anyway, so we have a lot of mumbo jumbo surveys coming out there. But the more reliable surveys, one issue we have is that, back in the day in 2016, they used to have media sponsorship. So every a week or two, they had results coming out. So you could see the dynamics coming out right away. Now those sponsorships seem to be gone. So they release the results very late. A month later, 3 weeks later, SWS is even not in the game anymore, as far as we know. Pulse Asia releases it 2 to 3 weeks later. So it's very hard for us to track it authoritatively the way we used to track it in 2016 election. So the information ecosystem is very, very different. And for us political analysts, political scientists, commentators, that is the problem we have. So what we do at best is kind of run different kind of surveys against each other and look at the pros and cons. But it's very hard to pinpoint and say this survey accurately is capturing the latest mood. Because as I said, the authoritative surveys themselves are kind of delayed in the results, and it's not cheap to do nationwide good surveys. So I also understand the limitation of Pulse Asia or SWS, for instance.
But do you, based on the polls that have been published, do you have a sense that it is Marcos in the lead, or do you think there might be a surprise?
I think definitely Marcos is in the lead. I mean, I'm sorry for our friends, the liberal friends, they're gonna hate me for saying this. Come on, you're not. I mean, one of the ridiculous thing happening in the Philippines right now is this. So some in the opposition cannot accept it. Say, oh no, this is a lie. So
fake polls, right? Fake news.
We have to rely on Google Trends, which is like the craziest thing I've heard. So now my joke is that, will Google Trend tell us about our love lives maybe, or the weather next week, So because LENI is doing better on Google Trends, which is really about interest rather than preference, right? Trump did very well on Google Trends. They're forcing that point, but this is not helpful. But all I can say is this. I'm worried about the future of the Philippines information ecosystem, which inevitably will affect its democratic aspirations, if anything of it will be left after this year's elections. Because if the information ecosystem is the way it is, it's muddied. If authoritative surveys are not as authoritative anymore, or not as regularly accessible anymore, it's very easy for pillars of disinformation to step in and make the situation, essentially poison the well. So this is the difficulty we face. And as I said, I'm very active also on social media, because I realize, it's like, of course, I mean, we do all of our, let's say, blue chip interviews and all, but barely anyone watches them anymore. Everyone wants to watch vloggers. So because of being active on social media, you can really sense the pulse. And I could say definitely Sara Duterte and Marcos are very, very strong. And it would have taken a much more unified opposition to give them a good fight. But then again, miracles happen. It's not very probable. Miracles happen, and I think the opposition is hoping they can pull off what they did in 1986. Going back to your experience, in 1986, remember, it was a snap election.
That's right.
Corazon Aquino, totally no background in politics, a widow of a very shrewd politician, a hero of the Philippine democratic struggle, Nina Aquino. She only had around 1 month to defeat Marcos, and she managed to mobilize a huge groundswell of support. So I think the LENI folks, some of her supporters, want to replicate that. Except, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Let's see how well it rhymes this time.
and I can't leave this topic without asking you about Manny Pacquiao. Everybody thought Filipinos love celebrities, they love famous people. Right. Manny Pacquiao is the most famous athlete probably in Philippine history, if I'm not mistaken. Sure. I mean, why is he not doing well?
Well, this is the guy who actually lost a congressional race back in the day. So it is true that a lot of celebrities and actors have been entering Philippine politics, but I would say this is less a reflection of culture per se, but institutional damage wrought by Marcos. If you look at the Philippine Senate back in the 60s, in fact, all the way to 1990s, you would find people with PhD in law from Yale University. So that was the kind of caliber we had. So that's why I take issue with people who say, oh, Filipinos, of course they'll go for actors and all. But no, if you look at our senators, until quite recently, our Senate was quite high caliber, I would say.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. But I remember you had the former president of UP was a senator, Ed Angara.
Yes,
you had a lot of
Angara, and then you have
Blas Ople. You had some smart people there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you had, again, I don't want to sound elitist, but you had a lot of Ivy League trained folks. We still have a couple of them, including son of Angara, Mr. Angara, another Angara, Sonny Angara, who's there. But one reason why celebrities have been coming in strong is because Marcos destroyed the two-party system we used to have. It was not a perfect one. It was very similar to the Americans. We had the liberals and the nationalista, kind of Republicans with the liberals. And Marcos just totally destroyed that. He corrupted the system. He corrupted the judicial system. He corrupted the media. So the idea that suddenly Marcos is gone and everything will be back to some sort of paradisical situation, it was not true. It would have taken a Herculean effort for us to overcome that. And unfortunately, we didn't. So what happened was when the party system was destroyed, essentially by Marcos, and not replaced by a functional party system, what happened is two types of groups filled in the gap: political dynasties, right, and celebrities. And now you have an incestuous relationship between the two. And you have situations whereby celebrities become dynasties. So for instance, Pacquiao's, I think, brother, wife, son, all of them are entering politics. So this is what we're seeing in the Philippines. Once the political party system collapsed, we had a pretty decent one back in the day. And when it was not reinstated and revived after Marcos, unfortunately, a suboptimal replacement took place, and nothing has been done about it. And this is what I say to the liberals: like, you whine and all about, oh, Duterte and Marcos and this reformation, but what on earth did you do to make sure the system functions? I'll just give you some numbers very quickly, just to put things into context. According to latest studies, up to 90% of the Philippine Congress and elected offices is dominated by political dynasties, if you count also the children out of the wedlock. If 90%. Not, maybe 75%, if the legitimate children.
Your children out of wedlock.
Yes, 90% pretty clean. And then number two, in 2011, according to World Bank, I know these numbers by heart because it's just so shocking. 76% of newly created growth was taken home by 40 richest families. So essentially, we're the most economically unequal country in whole Asia. Politically, we're even worse than Latin America, because in Argentina, I think the numbers are like 5 to 10%. Mexico, maybe 10%. We're at 90% political dynasty. This is imagine all Bushes and Clintons all over the place in the Senate and Congress. That's essentially the situation in the Philippines. So why on earth are we shocked that people are voting totally outside the box, or getting something from way in the past and saying, let's just go crazy. It might just work.
That's fantastic. I like how you count the illegitimate children versus the legitimate children.
We have to be clear about that.
You gotta be clear.
Just to give you a number, there is a Senate race right now. Two sons of President Joseph Estrada running. JV Ejercito from another wife, and Jingo Estrada from the original first wife. And the two brothers are fighting who's the real good son. So that just tells you the situation in the Philippines. Yeah.
I was actually sitting with Joseph Estrada when he found out he won the election. When we were sitting on his porch drinking whiskey, and he said the first thing he did was go to church when he found out he won, and he said, "Forgive me sin," to Cardinal Sin. He said, "Forgive me sin, for I have fathered."
Really prolific guys. Yeah,
he's a very prolific guy. But one last question on the campaign itself. And this actually is a question that came from my teaching assistant. I'll give her a shout out, Tina Villarreal. She asked the question: do the debates matter at all? Did debates matter? I guess Marcos skipped most of the debates or all of the debates, and Comelec decided not to have many of them. And I asked that because in France, for example, They were very close, Macron and Le Pen, until the debates, and then that showed that Le Pen was not really quite ready for the presidency, and Macron was able to show that he was authoritative and in control. Talk about debates in the Philippines.
Yeah, I checked the numbers because I watched the debate. Yeah, I mean, Le Pen did horribly on the question of hijab banning. I mean, she was totally out of this world. I mean, you could see Macron couldn't believe his luck. Like, I mean, can you be that, out of this world, right? Like, you're gonna start the civil war if you do that. I watched that, although I heard that some numbers said only 12 to 14% are waiting for the debate before making a decision. But I think that was big enough for the gap to really widen from 44-50 plus to almost 60-40. In the Philippines, it's a curious case because what's interesting is that people actually watch the debates, right? There's a lot of interest. I do breakdowns on my own Facebook Live, etc., and I see interest. Hundreds of thousands tune in and watch, right? Over time, so I could see the interest level is there. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. hasn't bothered to attend any single debate of note, caveat, but he attended a number of debates organized by, how should I put it? Let's just say friendly territory, right? And no one else of note except one opposition candidate essentially joined those debates. So it kind of looked like like good morning myself. But many people watched that. And one of the fascinating thing about that debate, if you can call it a debate, was that they spent 2 hours discussing foreign policy, which was fascinating. A former professor of mine was actually on the panel schooling them. I mean, essentially schooling them like a bunch of thesis I mean, like it's a thesis class. And Bongbong Marcos actually sharpened his tone suddenly on China. And he said, I'm going to send warships there to South China Sea to protect our fishermen, which was like fascinating. It's like, okay, so he felt the pressure, public pressure. So no, I don't think the debates are as consequential as they should be or anywhere close to what we see in more mature democracies. But there is a kind of I would say, thirst for intelligent discussion in this country. I would definitely say that from my experience across all socioeconomic classes. And what Marcoses did was to actually do it via, again, YouTube, do it via TikTok. So they didn't engage others directly, but what they did is they're engaging the voters directly by giving this kind of cinematic production level grandness of the supposed achievements of the Marcoses. And since you have Imelda Marcos in your at your side, I'm sure they're well versed in how to play the game of perception.
And I will give a second shout out to my teaching assistant Tina, because she was kind of horrified when she told me she saw a Bongbong Marcos. Sorry, that's his nickname. Everybody, Bongbong Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Yeah, she saw a Bongbong Marcos TikTok video, and she was saying to me, on a social message group, she said, "What's happening? Is this the way we're supposed to elect a president based on whether or not they can put together a nice TikTok video or a nice video?" I mean, how important is social media to?
It's going to get worse. Let me put it this way. Don't be surprised if he becomes the president. On TikTok, we'll get to know what his next foreign policy position will be. Probably have to be on YouTube channel too. Now, I'm half joking, but I won't be surprised. And we got to know this morning that his spokesman just got suspended on Facebook. And we know why some people get suspended on Facebook.
Really? What did he do?
Because they don't get suspended for disinformation. That's where I'm going to look for stuff, because Bongbong Marcos he's a smooth operator. Let's talk about the guy, right? The man of the hour, right? I'm not saying he's going to win, but we have to talk about the guy. You see, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is a very curious person. I wrote a book on Duterte right away the first year he came, because it was like, this guy is interesting. Let's just put it this way. Ferdinand Marcos is a much more familiar specimen to me, because my mom comes from the north. I come from the north. Ilocanos come from, and that's where the Marcoses come from. So there are, quote unquote, one of us, right? I met him in the past. We were speakers together in university. He's nothing like his father, right? For better or for worse. His father was really this kind of suave, confident, extremely articulate, wildly ambitious man, right? That eventually went off the rail and became a dictator, right? And then it just got worse from there. He's very different. He's a chill, avuncular, charming, approachable, not super duper impressive guy. Yes, he attended Oxford, never graduated. He got into Wharton. I don't know how on earth he got into Wharton without an undergraduate. He didn't finish it. He has a very womanizing, relaxed background. But he's articulate enough, unlike Duterte, right? He's articulate enough in discussing foreign policy, macroeconomic policy. He's not cost-laced. He's very princeling, to use the kind of Chinese term. He's very princeling. And he loves affirmation, perhaps, by the society of the world, unlike Duterte. Duterte was really this kind of a parvenu who knew he will never make it to the society, right? To the appreciation of international community. Ferdinand Marcos will be very, very different, right? Now, but one side of Ferdinand Marcos that people tend to forget is this. He got a training in special forces. He was the guy, if you remember, during 1986, he was the guy in actually military fatigue. And he was the hardliner in 1986 who wanted his father to take more drastic, aggressive action. So everyone now remembers his charming, cute, almost K-pop look on TikTok. But people forget that he had this hardline special forces side to him that he intelligently essentially worked through and worked over and curated over the past decades or so. So part of me saying, I don't know if you guys have watched the movie Gone Girl. You'll get what I'm saying here.
Yes.
That should he win really by a big majority, let's say 60%, which is not unlikely, I think we'll suddenly see a transformed version of Bongbong Marcos, which is much closer to what he was when he was really a princeling or the heir apparent than what we have been seeing over the past 2 to 3 decades. Because I hear a lot of liberal friends, sorry for keeping on going back to our liberal friends, because I don't want this to be an echo chamber, is that I hear, Bongbong Marcos, he's not his dad, he's this and that. So it will be the women who'll run it. The sister, the wife, the mother, whatever. And I said, everyone was saying the same thing about Benigno Aquino, God bless his soul, when he ran in 2010. It's like, he's not his mother, he's not his father. He was very mediocre. But you know what? When he won the presidency, he transformed. Suddenly he had this sense of destiny. And God bless his soul, he made pretty good reforms when he became the president of the Philippines. Now, maybe we'll have a kind of a converse version of that. If Marcos wins big especially, I think he'll suddenly have this sense of destiny. After 3 decades of being in the shadows of strong women, after 3 decades of being told your father is better than you, what on earth have you achieved, you're a flunky, etc., he might finally grab the opportunity to set the legacy for himself, not just for his family. And that is the side of Bongbong Marcos that I think a lot of people are missing. They're all saying, it's going to be someone else running it. Everyone's thinking about who'll be the Rasputin. They forget he could be the czar here and he could call the shot himself.
That's really interesting. Let me ask you, I don't know. You said Bongbong is now, I didn't actually know he was that old. You said 60? Or
yes, he's mid. He doesn't look that 60s. Old because he's curated very well.
He's like a good-looking guy. I mean, he's got all of his hair. Yeah. Perfect, none of it's
nice
gray.
Hair. And like nice skin. And then he wears these bomber jackets with like V-cut shirts, kind of like K-pop.
He's got the bomber jacket. He probably looks better than I do. But
I'm telling you, the guy. The life, I mean, he has lived a good life.
Okay, so we're probably the same age. He got a little bit more money than I do. Yes, maybe, I don't know. But what from your watching him, what issues do you think he's interested in? What will he do as president? What has he done in the past, and what will he do as president?
Well, I mean, he has passed a lot of laws, and I think based on one count, like 70% of them were like holidays, new holidays, national holidays.
I like holidays. I like holidays.
I mean, I like too. I'm just saying it's not the best reflection of intelligent legislation.
I seem to recall from the Philippines, you already have a lot of holidays.
Yes. So apparently, Bongbong Marcos is a kind of a forefather of a lot of good times you have been having. Just to put it mildly. No, I mean, how can I put it? As far as Ferdinand Marcos is concerned, as I said, if he wins big, which is it's a big possibility in itself. He wants to leave a big legacy. So I think he will really continue the infrastructure projects of Duterte. And we know dictators and their science love it. I mean, from Napoleon III onwards, it is the way to leave a legacy. Big infrastructure. So monumentality is something that will be there in the vocabulary. The mother is obviously there to do the curating and all of that. The other thing I think he would want to perhaps do is also to disarm his critics. So for people who are watching for a martial law declaration in the first 100 days or even 6 months, forget about it. You're up for a disappointment. The guy is out there to disarm you and make you guys look like a fool. In his first 6 months, he's going to arrange interviews with all international media. He's going to show a very lovely face to everyone. They know how to play the game. They are charmers. They learn their lessons, and they systematically work their way back. I have described the return of the Marcoses, or the impending return of the Marcoses, as a counter-revolution. It's like the Bourbons making it back, right? So they really work their way through from the grassroots upwards, from low-level politicians upwards, from international partners downwards, and now everything is coming together. Everything is aligning for them, and they're just weeks away from having Imelda Marcos on the veranda in Malacanang and saying, "Here is my moment of vindication." And perhaps, in fact, I would say that's exactly the reason why Bongbong Marcos is running, because Imelda is 92 years old, I think, and I don't think she wants to go into the sunset unless she's back in that veranda. And I think she's just waiting for her time. And the fact that Imelda has not shown herself at all in the past 6 months just tells you the message discipline. Because they said, "Mom, just don't say anything. We will get you there. Just let our Analytica guys take care of everything." Swiss Analytica, I don't know, not Cambridge Analytica, whatever other Analytica they're having there. Let those guys run it. We will get there, please. So the mom right now is working on the internal architecture and the decoration, especially because, I mean, Duterte is not the most tasteful guy, right? So I think a lot of redecoration will have to be done by Imelda.
We know here at the FCC, we showed that movie, The Kingmaker, about Imelda Marcos. I don't know if you've seen it, but is she still in the picture? And also, isn't there a sister? There was a Marcos daughter, Aimee. Is she involved?
There's Aimee Marcos, who's I think more a reflection of her dad. Very shrewd, very articulate, very smart, very aggressive. I mean, she's definitely a feisty woman. There's the mom, obviously. She's around. She's still, I'm sure she would love to give another version of Kingmaker. Now, the Queen, probably that will be the prequel. But there's the wife, Lisa Araneta Marcos. She is, they say, the one.
I know that name, Araneta. I know that name. Was there some place in Manila called Araneta Center?
Yeah, I mean, the Philippines is really, as I said, the elite is a kind of a small world. Some would even say incestuous, right? It's like really a few families have been running the country. Sometimes they're against each other. Sometimes they're intermarry. So the wife, many would say, would be the most powerful first lady since Imelda Marcos. That is one. This is the common wisdom nowadays. Let's just put it that way. But as I said, I won't also count out Marcos himself getting a sense of destiny once he wins the presidency. Oh, sorry, if he wins the presidency. I might get canceled for saying if he wins the presidency.
Yeah, I'm getting some messages coming in. Apologies for looking down here, but this is from I believe it's from Joel, the Duke, FCC member. And good friend. He says, "Hi, Keith and Richard." It's a bit long, so I'll try to shorten it here. He says, "If I understand what Richard is saying, older people are more nostalgic about the discipline and the power." He's saying that's not what he's hearing from his in-laws in the Philippines. They're actually missing the time when a normal wage in the Philippines for the middle class was enough to feed a family and live a decent life. But nowadays, an average wage in the Philippines for a university graduate is not enough to feed a family, and forcing people to leave the Philippines and come abroad to places like Hong Kong. And he goes on to say, I remember one of the first decisions Duterte made when he came to power was to increase, maybe even double the wages for policemen and nurses. He said, and I'm just reading from his message here. He said, "I'm a bit shocked that you guys are joking and debating about this system that seems to be costing tens of millions of people who are starving while a handful of families are getting money concentrated. This is a really serious situation," he's saying. I mean, is that what you see, the economic situation? Sorry, if anybody thought we were joking, we're not joking about it.
I mean, I think the challenge for us is how to discuss it without being cynical, right? As I said, the biggest threat to a democracy is cynicism. And one of the problems I have is that a lot of people, when they discuss, especially our liberal friends, when they discuss the situation, it sounds so depressing that people lose hope, right? So that's why sometimes you have to have a different attitude and you have to put things into perspective, right? And my point is that when you look at the case of the Philippines, one of the biggest problems we have also is nostalgia. And this is a nostalgia coming from the older generation. I don't know about in-laws of who and what, right? I'm talking about the numbers, the data. What the data shows us is that in 2016, we still don't have the exit poll for this time. But in 2016, it's the older generation who rallied behind Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And it was the younger generation who rallied behind LENI Robredo. That's why LENI Robredo pulled off that very razor-thin margin victory, but victory nonetheless in 2016. As far as the situation is concerned, I mean, one of the problems we have is, where do you place culpability, right? Now, the easiest one is just blame the Spanish and Americans for everything that went wrong. I mean, it's not for the lack of colonial crimes against our country. But you see, the problem is that blaming Marcoses alone also won't do it, because we have had some time to fix things, right? We have had at least 3 decades to fix it. Now, blaming Aquinos alone is unfair because they had 12 years put together, but 12 years is not also a short time per se, right? So I think, you know, okay, I was having a conversation with a Brazilian friend, and he said, one of the things that Lula and the opposition need to do to regain back the support of majority of people, especially in the upcoming election, is to have a little bit of a mea culpa moment. That way, maybe Lula can get more people to support him. Although, and many of us are optimistic he will be the president again, and Bolsonaro will not make it. And I said, that's an interesting observation, because I think the liberals in the Philippines also have to have a little bit of a mea culpa moment. Disinformation is a problem. That's true. Some would even say interference, sharp power operation by certain foreign powers. That is true. Some would say lack of proper critical thinking education is a problem. That is true too. But at the same time, we could have done so much more to prevent this situation, to mitigate the situation. We could have had better strategic approach during elections, prior to elections. We could have done more with the 1987 constitution, for instance. For heaven's sake, why didn't we put anti-defection laws to make sure our party system works, that people don't change their parties every 2 weeks? I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Duterte ran on a platform, a party that had 3 members before his election. He wins, suddenly there are 300 members and allies. That's ridiculous. We didn't have, for instance, automatic laws against proliferation of political dynasties. And then if you look at the Philippines' industrial and trade policy, it perpetuates the power of the oligarchs, the big conglomerates who have made our electricity, our basic utilities among the most expensive in the world. So yes, the situation is beyond tragic, right? At the same time, we still have elections. At the same time, my goodness, this is not Russia. This is not, you know, the country's closer to you, right? There's still agency here. And therefore, there should be some chance for people to still be mobilized and do their job. And this is what we're trying to do here. But at the same time, we have to admit there's a comical tragedy to the situation, because it seems sometimes we don't want to learn lessons, and sometimes none of us want to admit responsibility. And we always want to point our fingers at a different direction.
And I have to say, because, you know, we were having a bit of fun, but, you know, elections in the Philippines always have this kind of carnival-like atmosphere around them. There's always celebrity, there's singing and dancing, and now we have social media involved. But let me ask you a couple more questions. One, before we run out of time, we got about 5 minutes left. Let me ask you about the press, the media, press freedom. You know, right here in Hong Kong, even as we speak, we're even here at the Foreign Correspondents Club. There's a bit of kerfuffle going on about press freedom. How free is the media now? I know there's been this kind of crackdown on Rappler, our friend Maria Ressa's site. ABS-CBN, I believe, was taken off. I'm not sure if it's back now or not. You can tell us, but is the press free to really report this campaign, or has the press been supplanted by social media and candidates' ability to kind of bypass traditional media? And again, having lived in Hong Kong, having lived in Manila, those 2 places, Hong Kong and the Philippines, always had the freest press in Asia. What's the situation now?
I mean, we are entering a gray zone situation, right? So on the surface, the media is broadly free. You know, Rappler is still operating. ABS-CBN is operating online. I think it's on the radio, but they're off their frequency for television. But honestly, I'm seeing and sensing and hearing more and more self-censorship, more and more intervention by corporate bosses in the editorial decision-making. I'm seeing more and more colleagues resigning or expressing discontent. And my fear is, if current trend lines continue, we'll be more like, I mean, you could see from my background, I know multiple countries quite well. So I always do comparative analysis because, as they say, if you only know one country, you know no country. So my sense is the Philippines could go in the direction of what political scientists call a hybrid regime. And I think Turkey comes to my mind. So for instance, what happened in Turkey is when Erdogan came into power, he didn't go as much as Putin, but his oligarch friends took over big media channels. And some of the media channels which were not as friendly, they use other means to go after them. Now, Putin also introduced a new strategy 2 decades ago, right? When he went after independent media, he used tax evasion cases. And, in the Philippines, because the whole political economy is so dodgy and the rule of law is not really the paramount issue, everyone probably has some sort of skeleton in the closet. So all you have to do is to kind of send a feeler there that you can be the next and go down if you don't do some of the adjustment recalibration we're doing. So the fear I have here is that we will have a facade of vibrant democracy, but actually it will be hollowed. And in the case of media, we'll see more and more self-censorship, more and more corporate intervention. And at the same time, you see the algorithms and the whole disinformation business is just so profitable. I know people who are making tens of thousands of dollars just themselves by just spreading nonsense online, talking about a supposed golden age under the Marcoses. We were supposed to be they're talking about this gold that will be given by this ancient family and all. I mean, for us, it's comical, but actually people believe that. So their engagement is in millions. I mean, total crap, but I'm sorry for saying that, but it has millions. So you have suddenly the rise of all of these bloggers and vloggers and how do you call them? Analysts, commentators out of nowhere. And they're doing very well because they're essentially feeding off on lack of critical education. They're feeding off on disinformation. So this is what I'm seeing. And this is really, really worrying me. So yes, on the surface, we may still be among the freest countries for the foreseeable future because the base is just so low in the region. But my fear is that it's going to be increasingly hollowed out unless something radically done. That's why it's very important for media, for Maria Ressa, for other key personalities in the media landscape to show more solidarity and support. Because I want to end on this note, Keith. One problem we have had in the Philippines is unhealthy competition. We have had, I'll just be honest, I have worked with different channels. I've worked with ABS-CBN, and I've worked in different. And one of the things I noticed, just to be honest, I noticed there's a lot of competition among journalists and people like that, and there's not enough solidarity. Competition is good. I'm all for competition, but solidarity is also what we need. And this is what is also lacking. A divided opposition is a big problem. Another one is lack of solidarity among media and journalists. It is coming, but it's not there yet.
We got about 2 minutes left, 3 minutes left. One question, and I'll wrap my last question into this question from our FCC member Henry Weir, who asked the question, which candidate do you think is most favored by the international community? And I'll just wrap that in with my question was, do you think Bongbong Marcos has a policy, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, there was a survey by Bloomberg of economists and clearly showed Leni Robredo as their top preference. I think the other one top preference is Mayor of Manila, Isko Moreno, kind of our kind of Macron-ish kind of figure, although a person from very humble background, but he tried to lift himself up a little bit more technocratic and youthful and all. So Bongbong Marcos was not a top preferred. Let's just say he's the least, probably among the least preferred, if not the least preferred, for understandable reason. But I won't be surprised once and if, let's just say, if Marcos becomes the next president, he'll try to come up with a very technocratically oriented administration to, again, dispel critics and all. That doesn't mean it will be heaven. It just means that prepare for being disappointment if you think it's going to be a kind of a mumbo jumbo cabinet. I won't be surprised to see some very high level Ivy League graduates, technocratic people there, just like what his father was able to do back in the day. There's some glamour with the Marcoses, unfortunately. There's some glamour.
And relations with China, do you think? What do you think?
Well, I think he'll be Duterte minus the over fawning over China. So I think he'll be more rhetorically calibrated. He's not going to say, I love China and I love Xi Jinping and all of that. But I think, yes, there will be a lot of openness to investments from China. And one area of big concern is investments in critical infrastructure. especially in telecommunications, among others. So maybe the next time we're going to join, I'll have to use two, I don't know, VPN or something like that for my own safety. So in short, if Marcos becomes the next president, what we can expect is I call triple H, right? High growth. I think growth levels will be decent for the foreseeable future, ceteris paribus. At the same time, I won't be surprised if there's also a certain degree of, high approval rating and high perception management and all of that. But also we're gonna have a hybrid regime. In short, there'll be elections, but we know who's gonna win the elections. So the room for the opposition will progressively diminish unless something significant happens, unless the opposition gets its act together, unless there's more solidarity, and unless this mass of people coming out in grand rallies of LENI Robredo transform into a movement. And next time, I hope if anyone is watching us, don't take our, how should I say, dark humor wrongly, because actually we're here on the front, okay? We're facing death threats, we're facing cynicism, we're facing a lot of stress. The last thing we need is for people to lecture us on how we're gonna present ourselves. So thank you very much for that, Keith. And I hope, people a little bit, take things into consideration. So definitely we're not taking anything lightly here.
Thank you very much, Richard Hadarian. Two final questions before we go, 30 seconds.
Sure.
Number one, will you promise to come back and talk to us? And then number two, I always ask all of our guests, what are you reading now? What do you recommend?
Of course, that part. Yeah, okay, yeah, of course. Yeah, actually I have a new book coming out with Melbourne University Press. It's actually on China and its relationship with the region. And I start actually with Hong Kong and Taiwan, then so on and so forth. So hopefully, who knows, maybe the situation will be better by the end of the year. We can have it in person, if not over Zoom. Speaking of books reading now, so I usually read multiple books at the same time and shift them so that I can read as many as possible when my mood shifts, right? Like I'm depressed, I'm stressed with all the trolls and death threats. So what I do is I read a more spiritual book. So I have been reading, because it was Holy Week in the Philippines, I already read The Zealot by Reza Aslan. So I read the other book by him, No God But God, right? So it's on the history of Islam. At the same time, I just finished just before that the book, and I really recommend you guys reading this. This is a fantastic book, just as fantastic as book of Reza Aslan, The Dawn of Everything. It is by these two fantastic anthropologists who question all of our basic assumptions. So everything you have read from, I don't know, Harari, Steven Pinker, Fukuyama, all of these books behind me, they have questioned all of that based on archaeological evidence. It's really a mind-boggling, beautiful book. And it's just around 600 pages of content and 300 pages of endnotes, but it's very well researched. And yes, for my emotional support, right? Because I have to keep up this, right? Even if there are some people who misread our humor, I'm reading, yes, Killing a Mockingbird, because I think there are a lot of things there that help us. My goodness, I mean, to put things
Harper Lee.
Definitely. As bad as things are in the Philippines, we know it has been bad all around the world. That gives you a sense of strength when you put things into perspective. So thank you very much, Keith. And
one of my favorite books, Richard Hadarian, Salamat po. Thank you. Maganda. Mabuhay.
Pleasure and God bless.
Thank you so much. Hope to see you in Manila at some point, or otherwise back here in the Zoom space. Keep in touch with us in the Philippines. Thank you all for joining us in the Zoom space. And then if you're watching this later on YouTube, and stay with us for the follow-up to the Philippine elections. Again, thank you. Goodbye.
Adios.